Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back. And today we are going to revise climate factors, which is lesson 8.1. This is a quick quiz review, so I hope you are ready. Let's get on with it. Um, so, what is weather? What is climate? So, basically, when we're talking about weather and climate, we're talking about the atmospheric conditions of a certain area. Okay, so weather is short term conditions in an area, and climate is long term patterns. So, just a quick example if you're going camping and you're wondering what the weather's like, is it wet? Is it humid? Is it dusty? Is it windy? We're talking about the weather, we're talking about short term. But if we're talking about long term, we're talking about climate. Let's say, for example, I ask you, what's the climate like in New Zealand? You generally say it's quite cold. What's the climate like in the Philippines? Well, that's kind of humid. What's the climate like in Saudi Arabia? It's kind of hot. Now, of course, it's not always hot in Saudi Arabia, and it's not always humid in the Philippines. But the climate is the general trend, and that is over a long period of time. It's the average trend, okay? So, what's the climate like in Russia? Cold. What's the climate like in Oman? Kind of warm, hot. Okay, let's move on. What are the factors that affect climate? Well, these are the factors that affect climate. We've got latitude. Latitude just refers to the distance away from equator. Distance away from equator. Okay, so the equator is this middle line in the earth. Oh, that is terrible. Middle line of the earth. Okay, and it's the line where the sun hits directly. So obviously that's the hot part. And then over here it gets a bit colder, and then over here the poles it gets really cold, that it's icy cold. So the distance away from the equator is going to affect the climate. How? If you are sitting on the equator, if the country you live in is right here, then chances are, oh, are you gonna stop? Oh, okay, here we go. If you live right here in the equator, then chances are the climate's quite warm. But if you live right here, like Finland, okay, or like right here, like New Zealand, then chances are it's going to be cold. So, yes, latitude, distance away from the equator, is very important. The other thing is altitude, and that is how high you are from the ground, right? So, if you live up on the mountain, then obviously it's going to be a lot colder than if you are on the surface, right? So, altitude is how high up you are, or how far away from the uh, sea level you are, or from the surface, right? So, that's the height. Okay, I'm just going to say height just to make things easier. Distance from large bodies of water. Yes. So the other thing as well is if you live close to a large body of water, like a sea or an ocean, then the temperature is going to be more temperate, more mild. And what we mean by that is the changes in temperature will be a lot slower. You see, water gains energy slowly, but also loses energy slowly. Whereas land gains energy quickly, gains heat quickly, and loses heat quickly, right? So what that means is if you live in the desert, it's really hot in the morning, but then sometimes in the evening it's really cold because that change in temperature can be massive. You can go from 40 degrees Celsius down to zero, right? Because it's sand and it loses and it's solid and it loses heat quickly and gains heat quickly. But if you live near the water, you see the thing about water or like oceans or lakes or sea is that it gains heat slowly. And so in the evening, it doesn't get cold quickly, it loses the heat slowly, right? So that means if you live near the water, the temperature in the morning can be about 30, and then in the evening can be about 15 to 20. So the difference is less than if you leave inland, than if you live inland. What about ocean currents? Well, if we have cold ocean currents, then they carry cold winds, and if you have hot ocean currents, then they transfer hot winds, and then global prevailing winds. Obviously, if you live in a country in the path of like easterlies, westerlies, trade winds, or any of those winds, then if those winds are hitting you, then they carry whatever they carry with them. So if they're coming in from like hot areas, then they carry hot weather with them or hot air with them. And if they're coming in from cold areas, then they carry that cold snap with them. So obviously the global prevailing winds do have an impact on the type of climate a country has. So these are the factors that affect the climate, which is the long term conditions, right? Let's keep going. So, what are the different zones we have? We have three different zones. We have the equator, where we have the tropical zone, and the tropical zone is like kind of like that humid zone with like monsoon rains, and it doesn't snow. It's usually warm, and the difference in temperature is minimal. So it goes from like 20 degrees to 35 degrees kind of thing. It's usually quite warm, and as we said, it's quite humid. So places like Indonesia, the Philippines, the coast of Kenya, parts of Yemen. These are all like tropical climates. They're usually green, they usually have a lot of rain, and they're usually very humid, and quite warm. Okay? Whereas we have temperate areas over here because they are further away from the equator, and these are the ones that really truly experience seasons, right? So like winter is winter and summer is summer kind of thing. And then you've got the poles, which are like really cold. Okay, so the poles is where we have ice, and and that's where it's really cold, right? So those are the three types of climate. So we've got polar climate, we've got temperate climate, and we've got the tropical climate, right? Let's have a look. The altitude, as we said, is like how far away you are from the Earth's surface, and of course, the higher up you are, the colder it is. I don't like remember on the plane. If you look on the infotainment screen, it'll say, for example, outside temperature is like -40, which is really cold. But why is that? Because we're way high up. Now, the higher up you go, the air is less dense. There's less air. There's less particles, and it gets a lot colder. There's also less pressure. Um, so because we're further away, it's a bit colder, right? That's the short answer. The closer you are to the Earth's surface, the warmer it is. Now remember in class I also like to use the analogy of like a frying pan. So imagine there's a frying pan, okay? I'm going to draw one. Let's say for example there's a frying pan, okay? And my goodness, that is the worst frying pan I have drawn. Let me start over again. Here we go. Okay, here's a frying pan. And here is a light bulb. Not bad. And the light bulb is heating up. Now I want you to imagine the light bulb is the sun and the frying pan is the earth. If I was to ask you to put your hand on the frying pan, it's going to be really hot. But if I was to ask you to put your hand above the frying pan, then it's going to be colder. Well, that's kind of what it's like. Okay, if you go up the mountain, then you're away from the surface. You're away from the frying pan, so it's a bit colder. Even though you're closer to the sun, you're much further away from the surface, which is really hot. So that's basically how it works. Up in the mountain, it's cold, and that's why you have snow in mountains. And near the surface of the earth, it's warm. Okay, let's move on. Distance from large bodies of water, we already explained this one. So basically, when winds blow across the ocean onto the land, they moderate temperature in coastal areas, bringing mild winters and cool summers. The short answer is that water gains heat slowly and loses heat slowly. So basically, in the morning, water is not very hot. Obviously, it's kind of cold, even though it's summer. And then in the evening, okay, even in the summer evenings, it doesn't lose that heat quickly, so it stays kind of warm. So that's why we call those conditions mild conditions. So the changes, there's no extremes. There's no 10 degrees Celsius in the evening, 50 degrees Celsius in the morning. Nothing like that. If you live near water, and I mean like a coastal area with large bodies of water, like you're an island, then that's when you experience shorter or a much lower range. So sort of like, say, for example, 15 to 30 as opposed to 10 to 40, right? Right, let's move on. Ocean currents. Okay, so the thing you need to know here is that ocean currents move from the equator all the way to the poles. Like the hot currents move to the poles towards the cold, and then the ones in the poles, okay, the cold currents move towards the equator. And I've got a nice picture of that shows how that works. Okay, of course you would. Of course you'd get all crazy. Hang on just a second. You gonna be okay now? All right. So you see the equator. The equator is the part of the Earth that gets the most direct sunlight. So obviously it's going to be warm. And over here we've got the poles, which are a bit cold. And here's the Arctic Ocean. And over here we've got Antarctica. And that's all cold. And as you can see, the cold goes up towards the equator, and that's where the hot goes down towards the poles. And the same thing happens here. The hot goes up towards the poles, and the cold comes down, as you can see here from California and other areas, it comes down towards the equator. So that's how it works. The hot currents go from the equator all the way to the poles, and from the poles, the cold currents come to the equator. That's all you need to remember about that one. Okay, so what are the factors that affect precipitation? First of all, what do we mean by precipitation? The short answer is rain, but really not just rain. Rain, hail, snow, just water that falls from the sky in any form, whether it's liquid or solid. Uh, so basically, factors that affect rain are things like prevailing winds, mountain ranges, and seasonal winds. Okay, so all three of those factors affect the rainfall. And what we mean by seasonal winds is monsoons, and we're going to come talk about those in a bit more detail. So, prevailing winds are the winds that usually blow in one direction over large distances of land, so things like the westerlies, the easterlies, the trade winds, and so on. The amount of water vapor and temperature an air mass carries affects how much rain or snow it can produce, obviously. So if that wind carries a lot of water, then that will produce a lot of rain. And if that wind is dry and it's not carrying water, it's not going to produce a lot of rain. Okay? That's how that works. Mountain ranges. So I want you to remember something that I've said in class as well. Usually, countries that have rivers, so like for example, Euphrates River in Iraq. The reason why we've got rivers is because they start in mountains. So mountain ranges, the higher up you go, the colder it is, and of course, when the reason why mountains help with that is because water condensates, right? So when it's cold, the water condensates and changes from gas to liquid. And so it happens up on the mountain, the water trickles down and turns into a stream, which eventually joins another stream, which turns into a river, and so on. So basically, here's an example of what can happen. So you've got what's described here. This is a summer monsoon picture because we've got the seasonal wind coming from the sea all the way to the land. Warm, moist air is carried from the Pacific Ocean by the prevailing westerlies. Somewhat drier air continues to move eastwards, rising along with the slope of the land. Okay, so I want you to imagine this. This is just a small picture to represent it, but usually this can be like quite large. And then now dry air continues to move past. Once this air goes up on the mountain, it gets really cold up here, and then this gaseous cloud spills some of its rain and snow onto the mountain. So over here we start by a lot of rain, and then whatever water is left can fall as snow on top of this mountain. Okay, and that's why you've got snow on the mountain, like all icy cold. And then once all that water is gone, like in the form of rain or snow, then what we left here is dry air. Dry air. Okay, and that's how it works. It's pretty interesting stuff. Moving on, seasonal winds. What do we mean by seasonal winds? So these are monsoons, a seasonal change in wind pattern and precipitation caused by different rates of heating and cooling between ocean and nearby land. You notice these around the equator. You notice these in countries like Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, where I've been quite a few times, Brunei, and so on. So in the summer, land heats up faster than in, let me just move my face out of the way. In the summer, the land heats up faster than the ocean. Warm, moist air blows from the ocean to the land. Okay, from the ocean to the land. This brings heavy rainfall, often for weeks on end. Okay, it's quite crazy actually. The land cools down in the winter. The cold air blows from the land to the ocean. So it's the other way around. In the winter, it's from the land to the ocean. In the summer, it's from the ocean to the land. Okay? In the summer monsoon, we call it rainy season. The winter monsoon is actually a dry season. Let me put my face back in the square where it belongs. And let's move on and do some practice for the quiz. So let's have a look. Which of the following is least likely to affect how much precipitation an area receives? So we know that the ocean winds do affect it, or the ocean currents, I should say. do affect it, the ocean currents and therefore the ocean winds. The mountain ranges, the monsoon, the Coriolis effect doesn't really have much effect on precipitation per se, um, because all that is the winds turn to the left or to the right depending on whether it's in the north hemisphere or the south hemisphere, and that's got to do with the rotation of the earth. So which zone is usually warmer? Question 2, which zone is usually warmer? Excuse me. Which zone is usually warmer? Well, of course, we know that the earth has the equator and has those two other zones. These are the poles, okay, the polar zones, A and A, the polar zones. Then we have the temperate zones, B and B, and then we have the tropical zone, which is around C. The hottest one is going to be the tropical zone. Right, in a summer monsoon, the moist winds typically travel. In the summer monsoons, they travel from, remember, from the ocean towards the land. From the ocean towards the land. In the winter, it's the other way around, but in the summer, it's from the ocean towards the land. Okay? Let's keep going because it's talking about monsoons, obviously. Let's have a look. What is true about winter monsoons? Now, feel free to pause this and answer it yourself before I answer it. What is true about winter monsoons? They flow the other way around from what to what? So, winds blow from sea to land. No, that is a summer monsoon. They bring heavy rain to coastal areas. Again, that's a summer monsoon because it brings in the moist air from the ocean. Winds blow from land to the ocean. Yes, that's the way it works. They cause warm, humid air to rise. No, not really. A place's weather refers to what? Remember, weather refers to short term, climate refers to long term. So, weather refers to daily or short term conditions, which best describes the climate of an area near the sea, a coastal area. Remember, we said that if people live near the sea, then that results in more in them experiencing mild conditions, because of course the conditions will not change so rapidly because the water gains heat and loses heat rather slowly. Okay, so what will happen if to the climate of the areas near the sea? Very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter? No. In fact, the change, remember, range is a lot shorter. Steady high temperatures all year round? No. Mild winters and cool summers? Yes. So what we mean by this is the summers, they don't mean cool summers like they're cold. They just mean cooler than the areas that are not the sea, not near the sea, right? So yes, that's definitely the conditions. So if you live um, on an island, then you experience milder winters, winters that aren't really, really cold, and summers that aren't really, really hot. Okay, let's move on. When you climb high up in the mountain, what usually happens with temperature? Obviously, it decreases, which means it goes down. Increases means it goes up. Decreases means it goes down. Which of the following is not commonly used to determine a region's climate type? Okay, so typical yearly temperature, types of plants that grow there, distance from the oceans or lakes, and color of the clouds in the sky. Interesting question. Right. Don't really like this question at all. I don't think it's worded properly. And here's why. So, which is not commonly used? So, I'm going to go with both of these. Here's the thing, typical yearly temperature. Yes, that can tell me the type of climate because temperature tells me a lot about the climate. Remember, like if it's hot or cold or whatever. Uh, Types of plants that grow there. Yes, they can tell me about the climate as well. They're not commonly used, but they can also tell me about the climate. Distance from the ocean and lakes. We also know that the distance away from oceans and lakes can also tell me about the climate. Like if it's far away from the ocean, if it's far away from a lake, then I know the summer's really hot and the winter's really cold. But if it's close to a lake, then I know the summers are not really hot, not that hot, and the winters aren't that cold. And the color of the clouds in the sky, well, yeah, I'm gonna go with that one. That's, I think that's the most correct one there. Only because the colors of the clouds in the sky, clouds aren't long-term thing, and climate is long-term. So, yes, if there are darker clouds, they can tell me about like a storm coming. Or if they're light clouds, then they can tell me that there's, relatively clear conditions and it's quite dry. But we're talking about climate, and remember, climate is long term, and clouds aren't really long term. So, not a very nice question. I wouldn't worry about it too much. But yeah, it's if it's talking about climate, we're talking about long term things, not short term things. So the clouds are short term. Right, where do cold ocean currents typically flow from? Cold ocean currents flow from the poles all the way to the equator. Okay, where do they flow from? The poles. Okay, now when I was doing this revision in class, you might remember that I also had a 10th question there. I have since removed that question. Um, I am just going to check a few things and then I'll get back to you about that one. Right, let's go to modify true or false. The higher up you go, so what we need to do here in this section is we need to decide whether it's true, whether it's false. And if it's true, then we don't change anything. And if it's false, obviously we have to change the word that's underlined and change it with the correct word. So the higher up you go to the mountain, the warmer it usually gets. That is false. It actually gets colder. And that's the way you need to do this. Okay, so you put the F or the T here and then you change the answer here. Weather describes the usual weather conditions in a place over a long time. No, that's actually climate. Okay, so we don't call it weather when it's a short time, we call it climate. Warm ocean water flows from the poles down towards the equator. Once again, from the poles, it is cold water. Places with different average temperatures often have similar climates. Well, that's also false because if the places have different average temperatures, they usually have different climates. But if they have the same average temperature, then they usually have similar climates. Or if you prefer, you can say similar with similar average temperatures often have similar climates. What climate tells us about the short-term conditions of an area? That's not climate, that is weather. That's weather, not climate, if it's short-term conditions. Cold ocean currents move from the poles to the equator. That is true. A summer monsoon blows cool, dry air. No, it doesn't. That's the winter. Remember, winter monsoons are cold, dry, but summer monsoons are wet and warm. Okay? Weather includes the average rainfall, wind, clouds, and temperature over time. So I think what they mean here is over a long time. And no, that's not weather, that's climate. Places far from the ocean change the temperatures more slowly than places inland. That is also true. No, that's false. Oops. Far from the ocean. I think they mean near the ocean. If two areas have the same average temperature, they will have different climates. Once again, that is false. If they have different average temperature, then they have different climates. Okay? So there's only one true there. Moving on. What does this picture represent? Summer monsoon or winter monsoon, and how do you know? Well, I can tell you right now, it is summer monsoon, and the reason why I know is by the arrow. Look, the arrow is moving from the sea all the way to the land, okay? And because it's moving from sea to land, that means it is the summer monsoon. So summer, because it carries the water, the wind is moving from the sea to the land. Summer, because wind, the seasonal wind, okay, hang on, seasonal Zonal wind is moving from sea to land. Now you can also say um, because it's moving from water to land. That's fine as well. Label on the diagram where you expect to see snow or dry air. So snow I would expect to see it around here. Okay, just around here. That's where I would expect to see snow because it's high up on the mountain. And over here I would expect to see dry air because the air's already lost the rain and the snow that it had in it. Okay, and that is all from me. I wanted to keep this short. I hope it wasn't too long. Best of luck on the quiz. I'll talk to you soon.